I'm starting recording.
Okay. So I'll just start it by saying this. The two things I would like to talk about are why hell is such an emotional thing.
Pause for a second. Andres, we started recording right before you got here, so we won't do anything with this if you don't want to, but I just wanted to make you aware.
Okay. And we're talking about why, at least the questions I want to talk about in this hell conversation, which are why hell is such a emotionally sensitive topic, and why on Discord or almost anywhere people get so just incensed when the topic of hell comes up, which we've talked about some, and I think there's some good ideas that we've previously talked about. But then also the other thing that I wanted to do was, as best as we could, steelman at least all of the Christian perspectives on hell, because I think when people talk about hell a lot, at least on the Discord or in these channels, often I find that people are burning straw men. So that's kind of where I'd like to take it, I guess.
We lost Julian.
I don't think I've read or come across a single criticism of David Bentley Hart's book that gives me the impression anybody's actually read it, other than, found a line they didn't like and based a whole, essay on those series of lines. But yeah, you're right. It is something very deep in terms of it's at a foundational layer that we don't. It's not something that's really explicitly talked about that much. Like, you don't much of what you think or believe about hell is kind of, I feel like, implicitly handed down to you in the traditions that you're a part of, and it's not. It's almost like too deep to be articulated what's going on there, and so it's not. And it's almost it has this extra power attached to it because it's the thing that can't be named in some sense or explained or gone into. It's just kind of handed out as a tacit assumption of the different faith groups that people grow up in, especially in the West anyway.
Yeah, it's very so I grew up very much within the water you swim in. I grew up a believer in hell. That was just kind of the culturally handed understanding of hell, which is kind of, I would say, comes from the Bible, but also comes from a lot of unacknowledged, tacit, interpretive lenses that apply to the Bible that that are influenced by culture and Far Side comics, probably more so than the actual text of Scripture. And devils and pitchforks. And then I became an annihilationist, and I was an annihilationist for a few years. And then and now I'm a Christian universalist, and a lot of that. And I mean, the reasons for that are many, but in my journey through all those things, I was first amazed at how little I actually knew about hell. When I just was at the very beginning of becoming an annihilationist, I was just like, I had no idea about any of this stuff. No idea, very blind to all of it. And then in having conversations with people about the doctrine of hell, that was just reaffirmed all the time. It is a topic that I think people are really largely ignorant of, the different viewpoints, which is why I'd like to talk about that and why they're held. And we really, out of almost all the topics, probably next to like the Trinity within Christianity, it's unbelievable to me how difficult it is to get people to see what they don't see in regard to the topic of hell. Like, I've had repeated conversations with people about, like, even the biblical word punishment, and talking about how, and people just automatically, without thinking, like a Pavlovian response almost, take punishment to mean eternal conscious punishment. And it doesn't have to. It doesn't have to mean that. Like, punishment actually in the Greek and even in the English is what's called a deverbal noun, where the time is ambiguous. The time is what's the word? The word's escaping me. Like you can't tell the temporality of what punishment is. It's like translation. So like you could say this sentence, the translation lasted 2 weeks. Or you could say the translation lasted 2,000 years. Well, those mean very different things, because any shun word is a deverbal noun. It's you take a verb and you make it a noun, and the temporality is ambiguous. So like in the first one, the translation lasted 2 weeks. By that, you mean the act of translating. But if you say the translation lasted 2,000 years, you're talking about like a noun, this physical thing that is a translation, like the King James Version or something. They're different things, and that's ambiguous in the text. And getting someone to see that like your understanding of punishment isn't necessarily what the text is talking about. It's just they can't see it. It's unbelievable. So
Yeah,
it's complicated.
well, that's the question. It seems like, it's not something that made its way into the creeds, at least the early ones,
Yeah.
in a specific way. So it's curious just how it became to be so, how it came to be something that doctrinally that people are so absolutely certain of, whatever position it is they hold on it. Just like it's weird how people get really tied up in terms of like, interpretations of the book of Revelation and what that exactly means.
Yeah.
And so much so that it divides, different groups of people that are otherwise remarkably similar, but they just have a slightly different reading of the book of Revelation. And when the tribulation happens, blah, blah, blah. And that's enough to go a different direction from another body of believers. So I don't know. It's definitely something weird in the West in terms of these kind of schisms and the sort of certainty that underlies someone's decision that I'm so certain I'm right here that everybody else becomes a heretic but me. I don't know. It's very strange.
So one thing that's been talked about before, and I think this is true, is I think there is some of just that basic, simplistic ideological tribalism going on. And I can't remember who first said this. It was maybe Dave on the Discord, or I can't remember. I feel like it was that. I think the reason hell is so emotional for so many people is that it really touches on, they have so many connections, personal connections that are deeply connected to their understandings of justice. And so like if someone has been really wronged by someone else, like in grievous ways, if they have a superficial understanding of, say, certain strains, maybe of Christian universalism, you could be saying like, well, like that person isn't, like that's never going to be rectified, or they're just going to get out of a jail free card or something like that. And that strikes people as deeply unfair or unjust. And I think that's true as to why people, I mean, hopefully to Steelman, I would say, I don't think it's so much driven by ideological tribalism. At least I would hope not. I think it has more to do with a sense of justice and love and people. I don't know. I'm trying to think of the positive way to say like getting what's due them.
I think it's
mainly not getting away with harming other people or harming creation. But it's that sense of, if something terrible just happened and like a person did it and they caused this great harm, you want that harm to somehow be set right, and you also want what's wrong in that person to be corrected. And I think there are probably positive instincts in that. There's probably noble instincts in wanting this thing that is broken in someone corrected. and not wanting them to engage in those kind of behaviors anymore. And so for me, trying to steel man, well, that's not steel manning eternal conscious torment if it's just eternal, right? Because you're looking for some type of rehabilitation in that whole thing that I'm setting up. So I'm not really sure that I'm arguing the ETC side of it anymore.
Well, that's the hardest, honestly, that the hardest part for me of trying to really honestly steel man eternal conscious torment is there's nothing, it's just punitive. There's nothing like rehabilitating or reconciling or redemptive about it, except in the sense of just like I don't know, except in the sense of like making someone pay for their wrongs.
I think for me, it also depends on what one means by torment, right? The caricatures of it are, people roasting on grills, and even one of the stories, I've only read the beginning of David Bentley Hart's books, but I can't remember. It wasn't like a church father, but it was somebody early on where he, it was like a, Michael had to go, it was like a legend. It was kind of like a legendary tale of a monk or someone who was walking and he came across a skull, and the skull was of somebody who was in hell, and it started talking to him. I don't know if you remember that story in the beginning of Bentley Hart's book, but in that example, they were either hanging and all they could see were the backs of all the other people in hell with them. You couldn't even have like a real human interaction. You could just see people burning. And so when I think of torment, I think of kind of being stuck in the sins that are non-negotiable for you, the things that you've just fallen in love with, that you've allowed to inhabit your heart. And you say, I'll have God, but I won't have God if it means I have to let go of these things. And a lot of that is illustrated in Lewis's The Great Divorce. But I just think of like an eternal conscious torment. It's almost like you are your own tormentor, or your love of your sins has become your tormentor. And so that can go on eternally if you're never willing to let those things go. Now, some of the things that I understood David Bentley Hart to be arguing for is, well, there's no fairness and there's no love in allowing a creature to not be capable of seeing that there's something more valuable in those things that they're holding on to. I'm probably paraphrasing a lot, or I'm inferring possibly what he meant, but I'm just thinking, I'm not really clearly articulating the thought, I don't think, but the idea is to have a creature that could be in a position that could choose something lesser than God is not really freedom.
Yeah, David Bentley Hart's understanding of freedom is...
I think that's what he was saying. I can kind of see that point, but that doesn't sound like anything that corresponds to reality for me.
Well, and to your point of like that kind of Lewis, there are a lot of different positions within the broader category of eternal conscious torment. Like there are, I would say, most modern people, outside of just lay people, like whether they are scholars or teachers or theologians who would adhere to what is known as the traditional view, which is eternal conscious torment, are like no one. I don't know. Like I don't know of anyone who holds to kind of the Dante's Inferno, medieval Jonathan Edwards, like sinners in the hands of an angry God understanding of eternal conscious torment. I think most people are very much more along the lines of the Lewis view, which Lewis never really comes down dogmatically on it. I think the Lewis view that, at least in my understanding of reading The Great Divorce, the few times that I've read it, is you could read The Great Divorce and fit into any of the categories. Like, I think someone who believes in eternal conscious torment could read The Great Divorce and be like, yep. I think an annihilationist could read it and be like, yep. And I think a universalist could read it and be like, sure. And that's where I think the nuance is tough, because with like a soft eternal conscious torment, you could think, depending on the ways that you conceive of God and sovereignty and free will and agency, that like you are in a prison locked from the inside, and slowly your love of lesser things leads you to a point of almost non-existence, which is essentially like, that's annihilationism. That's like a soft, gradual, self-initiated annihilationism, essentially. But like the view of people that are like the Far Side comic, and people who quote like the worm does not die, and and like the gnashing and grinding of teeth, which are interesting textual things to talk about in the initial context where they come from in the Old Testament, which I don't think most adherents of eternal conscious torment are aware of. No, I don't know of anyone who really holds those views outside of like, I mean, there's maybe some like crotchety old men sitting around in certain churches that are like, yeah, they're going to burn, but I don't think that's a commonly held view, really.
I think there is a common instinct among humans to want to see someone tortured for an atrocious act, to want to see that kind of recompense. I think of an example. So I don't know if either of you are at all familiar with the comic book artist and writer Todd McFarlane. He created a comic book character called Spawn, and there was a movie in the mid to late 90s of this character. I don't think it represented very well the comic book itself, but I don't know for certain because I've never actually read the comic book. But I am a McFarlane fan, and so I've listened to him talk about it before. And one of the things, there's Shari. One of the things
we're recording, Shari. Sorry.
Yeah, no. Full disclosure, we're recording, but we don't have to do anything with this if we don't want to. And there's Andres. If you've never seen Andres before, Shari.
I have to
so handsome.
There was a character in that comic book story that was a child molester, and the character Spawn, and I'm probably getting this wrong for people who know the story much better than I do, but essentially the punishment that child molester got was just essentially this horrific thing. He like got strung up, and I think he had like all kinds of spikes that were stabbed into him, and just all of this horrible stuff that was done to him. And the idea in the way that story was written was that was what needed to happen to that person. Like if you torture a child or you abuse a child sexually or physically in any way, there really shouldn't be any kind of redemption for you. And, for some people, they feel that way about that particular act, or there are other acts that they feel are there are other things and other people that fall into that same line of the sacred, that you mess with this and there's a point of no return for you. And I think that is an instinct that is common in humanity. And if you can't think of what that thing is for yourself, my guess, and I could be wrong about this, is that we all have that in us somewhere that thinks that that's just too far. That's something that can't be forgiven. Maybe not, but I think that there might be something that lies deep down in, at the very least, in broken humanity that says, if somebody crosses this line, they shouldn't be able to get back. And perhaps that instinct is where the idea of an eternal conscious torment and the fact that it, quote unquote, needs to exist, should be there, or maybe that's where it's coming from. So that's just the thought. I'm not saying that I hold to that. I don't know really where ultimately I stand on it. I feel like what I would be closest to is annihilationism, but maybe what I would prefer is that there's a way for everybody to get out. There's a way for everybody to grow into the likeness and the fullness of Christ, and to experience the glory of God willfully, and to be in a place of union with God versus separation from God. My hope is that there is a way for every human, if not every being that exists, to have a way out. And I mean, I've even heard people talk about before, well, is there a way out for Satan? And, you start wandering into dangerous territory, but, there's a part of me that's like, man, I want everybody to be able to fully experience the love and the submission to God's love. But that's probably going too far. So I don't know. Maybe that puts me in eternal conscious torment.
I have a really, just an analogy that just popped in my head. So let's say you were an artist and you spent your life's work painting a picture, and it was, you put your heart and your soul into it, kind of thing, right? Yeah, it cost you everything to paint that picture. And then some little brat came in and threw a can of black paint on it. Would you just throw that picture in the garbage, or would you do whatever you could to restore it, to bring it back to your original intention for that painting, because it cost you so much? Like I think about the whole question of it in the terms of God as a creator, as an artist, and him working with this lump of clay, which to the early church fathers represented all of humanity, not just Adam and Eve, right? Adam and Eve were the co-creators of humanity, so to speak, or the procreators of it. But that lump signifies all of it. And that was his, Magnus, what do you call it?
Magnum opus.
Magnum opus.
Magnum opus, there it is. And so I have to, when I think about it in those terms, I think you have to think about it a little bit differently. You have to let go of the revenge thing. I think the last thing that the artist is thinking about is killing the child that threw the black paint on his picture. He's thinking about his picture. How do I fix this, right? How do I restore it? How do I bring it back? Because this cost me everything. So anyway, that's just a thought.
Shari, this is I would just pose this to you because I'm curious to see what you would say. And can you imagine a way that someone could be an adherent of eternal conscious torment? Like, what's the best version? If you had to just illustrate yourself the best way that you could conceive of someone adhering to eternal conscious torment, what's the best version of that you can think of?
The best version of torture.
Well, I mean, the best version. So, like, because I think you would say that there are people who believe in eternal conscious torment who aren't just sadists.
I was one. I was one of those people,
Can you imagine an educated, of the other positions, non-ignorant person who still affirms eternal conscious torment?
Yeah, and I think it falls in the direction of mercy and judgment, right? It's the concept of mercy and judgment that gives you the the ability to justify it, in a sense. God will have mercy on those who acknowledge his, or are in relationship to him, or however you want to put that, and judgment on those who reject him. I never actually saw it as a result of sin. Like, I don't think that the devil has a pitchfork and he's poking you for all the sins that you ever committed, because there's no end. Like, even the best of us have done terrible things. But it's a question of whether or not you accept or reject God. That would justify people dying, being eternally tormented in hell. I mean, that's
don't you think atheists, because I'm just imagining, because I've heard these arguments, and I imagine if Job were here, for example, he would say, and I think he said this before, and I've heard atheists say this, that like a God who would punish people forever, number one, for finite sins, infinite punishment for finite sins, seems unable to be reconciled. And then also, like, if you say, if it's apart from just the mere quantity of sin, and it's just about either intellectually acknowledging and bowing the knee to this person, just being like, I accept Jesus, and under these terms, like, this is either you do that or you don't, and that's what then gets you eternal punishment. Well, that seems, I mean, to me, even that seems pretty jacked up. Like, I mean, that's the kind of God that I think Sam Harris, that's the straw man of God that he constantly burns down, which is like, what a psychopath, what a megalomaniac.
Yeah.
And so, I don't know. It's and then the problem for me gets down to like people. There's all these different camps, right? Of like, and I'm not even sure how like an Orthodox would cage this, or Andreas, like what a Catholic would say, but like within a Calvinist or an Arminian frame, like a Calvinist says God elects some people to salvation, and I don't know how they get away from double predestination, but he just doesn't elect some to salvation, which apparently gets him off the hook for electing people to hell. But it seems like to me, not electing people for heaven means like by necessary consequence electing them for hell. But they don't say that, so I won't put that on them. I just could never get away from that as a Calvinist. And then like an Arminian, someone who believes in libertarian free will, would say like, well, there's co-agency in salvation, and we by our will go along with God's will, and that's part of the salvific act. It's I think the technical term is they talk about, it's a prevenient grace that God gives to all mankind that allows them to then choose and accept his grace or not. That's the general Arminian position, which to me is like, you still can't get away for like your situatedness, your context, your IQ, your family, your environment, it's still bound up within determined, if you think of it all still within those mechanistic agency terms, it's still deterministic. So I feel like you don't get away with it then there either.
Right. Like, it's always seemed to me to be culturally contextual, in the sense that it works. Those ideas seem to work in a Christian culture where everybody's exposed to the gospel and has the opportunity to make a choice.
Right.
But what do you do with the people who don't?
Right.
Right.
And that's one of the common arguments that, atheists or not, people have.
Yeah.
Right.
I'm curious what Andreas is thinking.
Well, I've been thinking a few things. Let me see if I can try that, if I can tie that together. As someone from the Eternal Torment gang. No, full disclosure, I don't have any affirmative position on anything in that regard. I believe there's hell, because that's what scripture teaches and what my tradition teaches.
Right.
Let's say I am going by Hans von Balthasar. I'm a hopeful universalist, so I hope that all will be saved, though I would never make a judgment about that. Neither make any judgment about anyone who would be in hell. So, going back to something that Jeff said earlier, and what you said and what Shari said, is the choice aspect. And how is it with finite sins, punishment for finite sins? First, I don't think it's not a punishment by God. It's punishment, it's a torment we would inflict on ourselves by turning away from God. And I think that God gave us the kind of will that we could eternally choose to look away from God. Tying that to finite sins, like in Catholic theology, we talk about mortal sins. Mortal sins wouldn't, if I would understand that, like, or let me just stumble through that. I think mortal sins are firstly habitual sins, that sins that become habitual to us, that we tend to do over and over again. And in that sense, they wouldn't be finite sins, because this would be repeated sins, because they're as a habit fused to us. So, and that's what I think, that's what I would think hell would be like, similar to C.S. Lewis, The Great Divorce. Something, and some of the visions like Saint Faustina had of hell also work together with that. If you haven't read that, it's interesting, if a bit depressing. It's like she describes it as hell being a place where we eternally and eternally experience the sin that we were most engaged in our life. And that might sound like fun in this world, but thinking about doing that forever, it really sounds like hell. It sounds like torture.
Yeah.
That reminded me of there's this Warren Buffett quote that I heard that I'll never forget, but I don't have it memorized, if that makes sense. So I always have to look it up when I think about it. But his quote is, the chains of habit are too light to be felt until they are too heavy to be broken.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. And I like what you were saying, Andreas. I mean, I think that's, who was the saint again that said that?
Saint Faustina.
Yeah, I think that's really good. And I don't, like, this is what's, I think this is one of my common goals, or one of my goals all the time in discussions like this is to try to be ecumenical and find what all these different positions have in common. Because even when you're saying something like that to me, I don't think I would deny the validity of that, even from a universalist perspective at all. I just think that eventually God wins, and he's more compelling than sin for everything. And I think God is the type of person who would not leave anyone to themselves. You know, he's the one who leaves the 99 for the one lost sheep. Like, that's who he is. And so the struggle that I get into, that I think a lot of people have, and I think it's largely based on their frame and their understanding of freedom and love and what is necessary for love to exist, because that's a common thing that I hear, is that a lot of people will say the ability to choose not God is a necessary prerequisite for love, is that this has to be a voluntary choice. And the problem I get into is that I don't know what it means, because of my understanding of God and his omnipresence and him as the fountain of all being and everything, is that what does it mean to have a will that somehow you put into some systematic category that is other than God, that God has no influence or control or agency or fountainness as a part of, that can consistently choose in opposition to him? Like, what is the nature of this will then? What is that? This thing that he has created outside of himself that consistently choose against him forever? I just don't think something like that exists. Yeah.
It's that idea. I think it's either Maximus the Confessor or Jerome, I can't remember which one, developed the idea of the gnomic will, right? So that the natural will is the will that, you know, we are created with, which naturally chooses the good. And the gnomic will is overlaid in the sense that, you know, when sin entered, the gnomic will then became a problem, and it is the, you know, the twisted version of the natural will, and that needs to be healed. So it's and when that is healed, then one is, you know, is again thrust upon the natural will, which chooses the good, which is the basis of the early church's idea of universal salvation, right? So it's not necessarily that God doesn't care about what you do.
Right.
It's that he can't hold you responsible when you have a broken will. He heals it, and then he you know, and then you will choose the good. Like that is what they're saying ultimately. Now I personally would call myself a universalist, but ultimately one can't be sure of these things because they're not spelled out for us, right? But when I think about the big picture, you know, there's Michael.
Back.
Then I tend towards universal reconciliation or ultimate reconciliation, which includes all of creation, which I think is fundamental to the idea. But yeah, I can't prove it, you know, and you know, like I love Callistus Ware's quote where he says, you know, if you don't believe in universalism, you're an ox, and if you preach it, you're an ass. Because you don't have any way of proving it, and you're basically yeah, I said this to Julian the other day, you know, you're just going to have to take a stance, and then that is, you know, the beginning of division, you know, problems between people. And so, like Luke, I agree, you know, we have to be ecumenical about it. And I think that it's right to agree, in a sense, to disagree, you know, on these things. It's okay.